Greetings, viewers. So this is a brief overview of Chapter 5 of my text, Third Supercycle. And this chapter covers what I call the post-1922 international revanchisms. This is a very specific term with a little bit of history, and the easiest and shortest way to explain what I mean by this is I use this term because it's no longer politically useful, nor historically useful, nor conceptually useful to use the term fascist. Fascism, first of all, which fascism, which time period, which fascist state, how do we define fascism? There are all these problems in using the term. The famous internet meme is, it shows a little stick figure and it says, anything I don't like is fascism. Yeah, that's the problem. It means nothing anymore. We need a better description of what the European the very first, response is, what we call fascism is usually meant to refer to Hitler's Germany, and the problem with that is Axis Germany was only one of the three Axis empires, and that much of its thinking, ideology, innovations are not unique to Germany. They were actually shared by Mussolini's Italy and by Imperial Japan. So the term itself is not useful, and it gets in the way of concrete analysis and of concrete forms of resistance, because we're just, hurling insults at a certain point instead of analyzing what are real contradictions in societies. So first of all, post-1922, why that particular date? There's a very good reason. Between 1916 and 1922, 41 anti-colonial and anti-imperial uprisings take place around the world. A massive wave, the biggest since the 1848-1851 uprisings. Most of these uprisings were either sympathetic to democracy or had democratic impulses somewhere, or were some form of democratizing. Almost none of them were immediately revanchist in the sense of going back to anything. These uprisings did destroy 4 empires, and they created 13 new polities. However, after 1922, sort of an inevitable, inexorable reaction took place. A wave of international revanchist regimes emerged all across the world in an attempt to either roll back or return to some form of society that didn't exist anymore, or to resolve the contradictions that those anti-colonial, anti-imperial uprisings unleashed but could not resolve through new forms of political association or new polities. And it's extraordinary the extent to which these revanchisms transformed the world. Between 1922 and 1945, they took power in 45 polities all across the planet. So this was a massive wave of reaction that swept across the planet in the same way that you had this wave of progressive regimes and uprisings, and you have this wave of regressive regimes and crackdowns and repression of various kinds. According to our World in Data, which has tracked these things, given a number for the total number of democratic regimes in the world, the number of democratic polities rose from 7 in 1913 to a high of 21, so triple the number by 1921, and then fell, due to the international revanchisms, back to just 11 by 1940. And of course, part of that was destruction of democracies during World War II. One of the things about this wave of revanchism is that it took place primarily in the semi-periphery and in the periphery of the world system. No revanchism actually took power in any of the 5 core polities, that's to say Belgium, Netherlands, France, Britain, or the United States. And for complex reasons, because they were neo-colonial empires, they had longer histories of literacy, of working class mobilization, of democratic institutions. There were revanchist movements in those societies, but they never took state power in the same way, or they took very localized power. So the United States, Southeast United States, there was Jim Crow, racial apartheid. That was essentially a kind of localized, racialized neo-colonial fascism. But it was limited in time and space to certain institutions in certain parts of the United States and didn't translate well to a national politics. So it's not a useful guide for understanding the entire society, even though it's important to understand, because as we'll see, the international revanchisms, they are truly international. and the technologies and techniques of repression employed by the southeast United States in the form of Jim Crow are an inspiration to many of these other regimes. They sort of look at what the core polities do in terms of neo-colonial repression in the United States, or colonial repression in the case of France and Britain, and learn from that and apply the same techniques to their own empires or their own societies or polities. Now, that said, these international revanchisms, there are dozens of them, but they were extremely diverse, and it'd be an enormous mistake to just write them all off as, oh, they're just all fascist, or they're all hopelessly bad. They were very contradictory regimes, extremely contradictory, that were mostly revanchist, but also because they were a response to something, they also had to take those progressive regimes and those progressive revolutions into account. They had to respond in various ways, and so they kind of featured a strange mixture of progress or progressive promises and regressive policies at the same time, and sometimes in the same frame. To give you a sense of the diversity of these regimes, they ranged obvious cases of the personalist dictatorships, which ruled independent Austria in the 1930s, and Turkey under Ataturk and his successors, very authoritarian regimes, all the way to the Stalinist empire of the Soviet Union, Stalin's dictatorship, all the way to the what I call the conquest adventurisms of the Axis powers, the three Axis powers: Axis Italy, Axis Germany, and Axis Japan. And then other varieties include the corporatist regimes that ruled post-1928 Mexico under the PRI, or the Estado Novo in Brazil under Vargas, Getulio Vargas' authoritarian system, which reorganized society in certain ways. You can look at Portugal under Salazar, Spain under Franco. These were all very different regimes. They did not follow the same path. They couldn't be fought in the same way, and the forces of resistance to their authoritarian rule were different in each case. So there were commonalities between them. They were international, and they were predicated on an international reaction as they saw it. In other words, they sought allies and modeled themselves and learned from other forms of revanchism and learned to apply, modern forms of political association. This is one side of the story. And the other side of the story is they represented a radical modernization of political systems, a very paradoxical one, because for all of their attempt to go back to things, they had to go back to things by sort of reinventing forms of authority which were no longer salient and didn't work in the same way. Best way to explain this is the very typical, the most typical 19th century dictators or figures of revanchism, the industrial revanchisms of that time period. And the most famous are the first Napoleon and Napoleon III, both in France, both part of a French national imperial expansionism, trying to impose its order or to enlarge its empire at the expense of other polities. The typical institution of those regimes was the industrial dynast. And the industrial dynast was always sort of a strange, ambiguous mixture of the dynast king, so the monarchy, and the popular plebeian hero of the people. So it was a partial democratization. It had a foot in both worlds, the new industrial democracy and the old king principle. And they never quite fit, of course, but they sort of held things together by having both of those poles in the frame at the same time. The international revanchisms, on the other hand, they do something different because they don't create industrial dynasts in that sense. There's no semi-feudal component to their rule. They create thoroughly modern industrial dictatorships based upon power and guns and violence and fairly open class interests and so forth. And so this is the difference between Napoleon III and a figure like Mussolini in Italy. So these are very different regimes, and they operate in very different fashion. One of the big differences with international revanchisms is that their claim to modernization is actually much stronger. Napoleon, the Code Napoleon, did not change too much about the societies it was imposed on. But when you look at the rule of Mussolini, and Mussolini, the case of Mussolini is especially important because he really sets the model for many of the international revanchisms. And so much of the chapter does a close reading of what Mussolini does, how he rules, and how he sort of balances all the different tensions in the society, and he sort of offers something for everyone. And one of the things that he does was to create a system, or create the appearance of a dictatorship which is for everyone but somehow serves everyone at the same time that it venerates tradition. And it goes back to these firm. So Mussolini is constantly going on about reinventing the Roman Empire because that's the solidity, that's the marble base upon which the statue of Mussolini has to rest. So it's this weird balancing act between the past and the present. There's a radically industrial modernizing impulse, and there's a radically conservativizing impulse in the same framework. Many historians have talked about this. One of the best descriptions of this, by the way, is R.G.B. Bosworth's 2002 biography of Mussolini, which is quite good and comprehensive. There's one paragraph in there worth reading which goes to this contradiction. And I'll just quote from Bosworth. Quote, "A Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's foreign minister, may have been at heart just another European young conservative. A Roberto Farinici, fascist party boss, may have wanted to burn down the palaces, but Mussolini's retention of a relationship with both indicates that his version of fascism was not so much split between moderation and revolution as built from these two parts and dependent on them in spite of their evident contradiction. Mussolini, in his preference for tactics over strategy and his partiality to be confined to mere politics, or polities, had opted not to choose between this or that ultimate definition of fascism, or of his own persona. The fundamental point about Mussolini and his regime is that it was, and had to be, both. It was progress and regress. Now, of course, it was all regress, but it had to pose as being progress. It had to pose as being for the people. So one of the characteristic features of Mussolini's rule, which will be copied by the other Axis powers, is a populist program of cultural entertainment and solidarity and a very limited, very hierarchical and patriarchal welfare state, but a genuine, some attempt to actually sort of moderate the gaps between the rich and the poor and to provide ordinary people with some benefits from empire. Now, this was all used to justify imperial expansionism, of course, but that impulse to buy off the people, that was there, and it was a structural feature. And this was not part of the industrial dynasties of the 19th century, where the economy was much less marketized, and there was a very different logic to ruling the state. So these 20th century revanchisms, they have to deliver something to their constituents. And of course, they make some promises and end up delivering catastrophe, but they do have to at least look like they're busy in office, and that is a fundamental difference from their predecessors. Second thing the chapter spends a fair amount of time unpacking is Mussolini's contribution to the three-axis conquest adventurisms. And I use that term very specifically as opposed to European fascism because that leaves out Japan. Imperial Japan has a regime. And also, if we just use the term fascism, then we get into this problem of using an epithet and not analyzing what made the three-axis powers really unique. Like they're a divergence from the other 45 regimes that experience some kind of revanchism. There are only 3 out of the 45. And yet, of course, they do the most damage and co-instigate a world war. And the reason is those 3 regimes all followed Mussolini's strategy of using the strategy of international revanchism and progress and regress and selling things to people in order to justify a new form of colonial adventurism. And so all 3 Axis powers want to establish a world empire. They figure the time of Britain has come and gone. There isn't a hegemon in the world system, so we'll send our soldiers out and conquer world empire and become rich and powerful that way. And of course, this is an absolute disaster, but they managed to convince enough people in their societies to, play along with this and participate in their armed conflicts and their national imperialism. I specifically focus on Mussolini for the simple reason that Mussolini really sets the model. He provides the blueprint or the template for the Axis regimes for the other two. They sort of copy what he does and they add their own innovations and specificities, but the model really comes from Mussolini. And the crucial thing about the conquest adventurisms, which makes them unique in relation to the other, separates them from the other from the other international revanchisms. The conquest adventurisms are all built structurally on colonial genocide. Okay, colonial genocide is not a bug, it's the central feature of what they do. They found their claim on empire on the notion that we have a mighty army and we're going to go and exterminate those subhumans over there and take their land and become a mighty empire that way. Okay, and again, when we mention genocide and the Italian Empire, that might shock you a bit because many people have the wrong notion that the Italian Empire did not commit the worst or biggest genocides in the 1930s and 1940s. Actually, Mussolini's regime does set the model for the Axis genocides and does so in its imperial expansion in Libya, a former province of the Ottoman Empire. The Italian Empire invaded in 1911, took over, and then it was a brutal anti-colonial war that broke out under Omar Sanusi, the great Libyan patriot, fought against Italian soldiers for a number of years. And so the Italian army went in, and under Mussolini's leadership, Mussolini sent in an army and basically told them to use scorcher tactics, and the Italian army killed half the population of Libya in the 1920s. So the Libyan population dropped from, we think, about 500,000 people down to 250,000 people. So this was a genocidal violence committed against the people of Libya by the Italian Empire. This was not the worst genocide of the early 20th century. Axis Germany committed far bigger ones. Axis Japan would commit bigger ones, but the tactics, the strategy were absolutely the same. Mussolini sets the model. He shows that you can do it, you can get away with it, you can lie about it, and other empires won't do anything to stop you. So this sets a very gruesome model, and so he does all this in the 1920s, and then he's also one of the first of the Axis leaders to start attacking other polities. And in fact, I argue that it was Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 that constitutes the true start of World War II. So it's not Hitler's predations, not Imperial Japan's attack on mainland China in 1937, it's 1935, the attack on Ethiopia. And the simple reason is that Mussolini wants to do to Ethiopia what he had done to Libya. Invade it, kill the locals, steal their land, build up a huge empire based on settler colonial principles. So that's the gist of this chapter. And at the very end of the chapter, there's a segue and then a little hint of what's to come. The next chapter focuses on one of the most important of these international revanchisms, and that is Stalinism. So the very specific ideology and ruling strata and society that emerges from the Leninist party state after 1928 and the Soviet Empire. And Stalinism has a very specific role to play because it's one of the most powerful empires in the world system in the 1920s, and it has its own logic, and it will also have a crucial role to play in terms of the outbreak of World War II. So before we go any further, before actually delving into the specificities of the Great Depression and World War II, we actually have to spend some time unpacking what Stalinism was, what it was not, why it evolved the way it did, and its effect on the world system.